Warning, this story is about death involving children. This first story is about three teenagers. If you are sensitive to this subject matter, you may want to skip this video. Hello, and welcome to my channel. Today's tragic tale is about two mothers in Michigan who murdered their children. This story will be told in two parts. Long before Andrea Yates and Susan Smith made national headlines, these two mothers flew under the radar. Murder itself is a heinous act, and I truly will never understand what makes a person commit murder. Murder of children takes on a whole new level because they are still so innocent and have no idea of the evils of the world. When it comes from the hands of their own mother, that takes it to a whole different level of sickness. It is disturbing and vile. This first story takes place in Harrison Township, Michigan. It is about the Dueweke children. Before we get into the tragic tale, let's learn a little bit about where it took place. Harrison Township is located in Macomb County and sits on the banks of Lake St. Clair. Lake St. Clair runs between the U.S. and Canadian border. It is very beautiful, and the biggest attraction is the Metro Park, where residents and visitors can go swimming, fishing, boating, play golf, among other sports, or hang out at the water park. You know, one of those towns in America that's beauty is to be admired and can make you forget that sometimes tragic things can happen in beautiful places. This view was actually what the Dueweke family would see when they walked out their front door. The year was 1979. Cynthia, who went by Cindy, was the oldest of three teenage Dueweke children. She was a 16-year-old honor student who was a senior, and Mark was a 15-year-old honor student who was a sophomore, both attending L'Anse Creuse High School. 12-year-old Karl was the youngest, and he was an 8th grade student at L'Anse Creuse Middle School. Around 3 p.m. on the afternoon of Thursday, September 20th, 1979, Karl returned from school and entered the kitchen. His mother, Patricia, was standing in the adjoining dining room and shot Karl 6 times. Karl would have turned 13 the following day. Around 4 p.m., Mark returned home and entered the kitchen. He saw his brother lying on the kitchen floor and was kneeling over him when Patricia shot Mark 6 times. Around 5 p.m., Cindy returned home and must have seen her brother's bodies when she turned to run back through the breezeway between the kitchen and garage. Patricia shot Cindy 8 times in the back as she was trying to flee. At around 5:30, one of Karl's friends called about the weekend they had planned to celebrate Karl's 13th birthday. Saturday, the boys were going to participate in a bike-a-thon at Metro Park, then celebrate with friends at Frosty Boy Ice Cream Parlor. Patricia answered the phone and told the boy Karl was sleeping. No idea what the hell Patricia was doing for the next 13 and a half hours, but she called her ex-husband, the father of her children, Ralph, the next morning at approximately 6:30 a.m. and told him to come to the house and that it was urgent. When Ralph arrived, she said, "I shot the kids." Then she told him she was sorry for ruining his life. She then showed him what she had done, and she said she had planned taking her own life too, but chickened out. At 6:45 a.m., the two of them called the police. Patricia gave no further explanation. Police arrived on the scene, and the only words Patricia spoke was that she wanted an attorney. Upon entering the home, police found 2 boys in the kitchen and Cindy in the breezeway. There were 24 spent shell casings at the scene. 4 of them were found in the basement where Patricia had set up a target on the couch down there to practice. She had handwritten her own will, leaving everything to Ralph, and also specified what funeral home to use. While the bodies of the children were being removed, Patricia was emotionless. She was arrested and taken into custody and was being held without bond. The following day, 42-year-old Patricia stood before a judge to be arraigned and stood mute and motionless, causing the judge to enter a plea of innocence on her behalf. According to a neighbor, Patricia had been depressed since her divorce from Ralph, which was finalized on August 23rd. The neighbor said Patricia was unsure of her future because she had no job training. The only job she ever had was at a dry cleaner's, and she only lasted 2 weeks. The neighbor and his wife had been visiting with Patricia often to make sure she was okay, and they thought she seemed to be better. Just the day before the shooting, the mortgage on the house was paid off, and she seemed to be happy about that. September 23rd, just 3 days after she murdered her children, Patricia was allowed to go to the funeral home to see them. She was escorted by deputies to the funeral home, and the only people in attendance were Patricia's brother and sister-in-law. She spoke to them briefly and then knelt and said prayers by the closed caskets. One of the deputies who escorted her said she showed no emotion and she acted like she was in some sort of trance. She was escorted back to Macomb County Jail before the funeral began. The children were later buried at St. Peter's Catholic Cemetery, which was just 100 yards from the Macomb County Jail where Patricia was being held. September 27th, security outside Patricia's jail cell had to be increased when she attempted to take her own life with bed sheets. She would try this 3 more times the whole time she was incarcerated. September 28th, Patricia's preliminary hearing was postponed so she could be evaluated by a psychiatrist. October 31st, 1979. The psychiatrist's findings were that Patricia was insane. That same day, Patricia's attorney entered a plea of guilty by reason of insanity, and she waived her right to a preliminary hearing. The judge ordered she would stand trial for 3 charges of first-degree murder. Now we have to backtrack a little to see what led to this, as if there is any logical reason, because there wasn't. September 7th, 13 days prior to the murders, Patricia had a heavy wrench and was headed towards her son's room when Cindy confronted her in the hallway, and Patricia hit Cindy in the head with the wrench and showed her a gun and said she was going to murder her and her brothers. This did get reported by Cindy to a counselor at the Macomb County Crisis Center. The case was assigned to Child Protective Services, and Cindy did meet with a caseworker, but she had convinced her mother to take the gun back to the store. However, because Cindy was a minor, in order to open a case, they needed parental consent. The caseworker made several calls to Patricia that went unanswered. At this point, I guess I'm wondering, why didn't they call Ralph? The caseworker finally contacted Patricia, and a family meeting was scheduled for September 21st, which was the day after she took out her kids. I have no idea what was going on with Ralph. He never made a public statement. He didn't really owe it to anyone. The only time we heard anything from him was when he made his statement to the police the morning Patricia was arrested. July 8th, 1980. No trial had been set for Patricia. Patricia pled no contest to second-degree murder charges. The judge would take the plea under advisement after reviewing several psychiatric reports. August 22nd, 1980. The judge found Patricia guilty by reason of insanity. Before the judge set a sentencing hearing, he would listen to testimony from psychiatrists who treated Patricia. Dr. Dreyer said Patricia suffered from schizophrenia, who thought of herself as the devil as she gleefully murdered her children, the only thing she loved in life, as a form of exorcism. He described her as unable to make elementary decisions. He said she murdered her children so they wouldn't have to make decisions and didn't want her children to suffer the same failures she did. However, the same psychiatrist also testified that she did it to get back at Ralph. This guy was definitely all over the place, because he also said she did it to cleanse herself because she had been ashamed of sexual relations she had with an older brother growing up. Patricia did tell the doctor that from the time she was 8 until 13, she had multiple sexual encounters with her brother, and that she found it pleasurable and couldn't justify those feelings, and that is what led to her psychological problems. The psychiatrist also testified that Patricia told him, "I never wanted those goddamn kids, if only someone would have asked, but it's such a male-oriented society that it never even crossed their minds." The doctor stated that she also told him in mid-September she started thinking of different ways to take out her children. The only guilt she showed to the doctor was what would her parents think of her. September 16, 1980, the judge sentenced Patricia to 5 years probation, and she would be confined to a mental institution until she was cured. So what happened? Why would Patricia decide to take out her children like this? I don't think we will ever truly know the full story. The psychiatrist who evaluated Patricia had a lot of different theories, but I guess that is a very definition of schizophrenia. Patricia was raised in a very strong religious Catholic household. She actually lived in a convent for a time and was on her way to becoming a nun. It's unclear why she didn't pursue that, but she met Ralph shortly after that. In the aftermath, her father said he never knew she was having any problems. She never confided in him or her mother. She kept to herself and always seemed to be able to handle things. Ralph moved out of the house in May of 1978. Patricia filed for separation in June of 1978. Ralph had delayed divorce proceedings due to Patricia's mental health, but they finally proceeded with the divorce in 1979. The divorce was final on August 23, 1979, and 6 days later, on August 29, Patricia purchased a gun. Ralph's attorney in the divorce stated that she was emotional, but they never suspected she was capable of something like this, otherwise they would have never granted her custody. People who knew Ralph and Patricia as a couple said there was a difference in personalities. Ralph was outgoing, and Patricia was very timid and old-fashioned. She never displayed any public affection. However, after the two separated and divorced, they still attended the kids' school concert and other events involving the kids together. Before the two separated, neighbors and friends would say that they took their kids camping, and since they lived on the Clinton River, neighbors would see them canoeing together as a family. Ralph was a social worker in the same school system his kids attended. He worked with students in the special education program. He was also a part-time realtor and was involved in the public library. I'm still questioning what Ralph was doing. Obviously, he had a passion for children, as his chosen profession was working with kids with special needs. Did he just think his kids were so self-sufficient they could handle living with their depressed mother? I mean, maybe he did. When the situation with the wrench and gun happened just 3 weeks prior, why wasn't this a red flag? Maybe the kids didn't want to tell him. But why didn't Child Protective Services contact him? Patricia volunteered at the school. She ran a food pantry to help feed the needy and was involved in the school band's booster organization. The principal said she was friendly. Nothing was mentioned as to why Ralph and Patricia decided to separate and eventually divorce. The judge ruled it irrelevant in his findings, and it never became public knowledge. By 1984, Patricia had been released and was living with her parents. No idea what became of her. Ralph did eventually remarry in the 80s and moved to another city. Okay, so when I started researching this, the very first person who popped in my head was not a murdering mother, but a murdering father. I couldn't help but see all the similarities between Patricia and John List. She totally gave me John List vibes. I'm pretty sure anyone who follows true crime knows of him already, but if not, you need to go check out his story. Here are the parallels I was able to find between the two of them. Although John murdered his entire family in New Jersey, he was born and raised in Bay City, Michigan, in this house. The state has nothing to do with what they both did, but it's just one of the many things they have in common. Both John and Patricia were raised in strong religious backgrounds. Both John and Patricia had suffered a loss. John his job, and Patricia her marriage, and obviously saw themselves as failures. Both John and Patricia took out their children in the same fashion, even having to chase one of them down. Lastly, their kids were all the same age, both having a daughter who was 16 and the oldest, both having a 15-year-old middle son, and Karl was going to be 13 the next day, and John's youngest was 13. Enough about these waste of space parents who both got to live their lives after what they did. Let's talk about the Dueweke kids. Cindy was a flag girl with the school marching band. She played the flute and was on the debate team. As mentioned before, she was an honor student and was in the 99% of all seniors in the whole county. Cindy wanted to pursue psychology and was already enrolled in college for next fall. The summer before her death, she had a job at Metro Park. Mark was a junior varsity football player. He wanted to become an architect and was the best draftsman in his class. He was in 10th grade and doing 11th grade work. Just the weekend before, he and his friends worked on the homecoming float at his home. Karl played the baritone horn in the school band. He was described as always having a smile on his face, very helpful to his teacher, and his grades qualified him for the Junior Honor Society. These kids were going places. They were all smart and would have achieved great things. I would really love to hear your thoughts on this in the comments. My opinion is I don't think Patricia wanted to take out her kids because she didn't want them to have to make their own decisions and suffer the same failure as she did. No, not at all. None of these kids were failures. In fact, they achieved much more in their young lives than Patricia ever had, and that's what I think bothered her. They would all move on and achieve great things, while poor old Patricia, with no social or working skills, would be less needed. Sure, what happened to her as an 8-year-old was awful. No child should have to deal with those things, but everyone in Patricia's life would eventually move on to better things, but not her. I do also believe it was revenge on Ralph. I imagine she blamed him for leaving her and her having to raise the kids without him. Like I said, let me know in the comments what you think. Thank you for listening. Make sure to check out part 2 for the next mother whose struggles drove her